Well, good morning, everybody. Greetings from Nepal. Jai Masih, which is roughly translated, Jesus is Lord. It's how believers greet one another, so Jai Masih. As most of you know, I spent the past 2 weeks or so on the other side of the world doing mission work in Nepal, and besides the 34 hours of travel each way, it was a wonderful trip. So this is the Himalayas. And most of us think of Nepal like this, epic mountains. Like the Rockies have nothing on the Himalayas. It's amazing. But most people in Nepal have never seen this view. For most people in Nepal, or for many people in Nepal, their country looks more like this. This is Kathmandu. This is in a valley, and it's the capital city. It's home to about 4 million people. But for most Nepali people, their country looks a little more like this. Small towns in a third world country, living in terrible poverty with crazy roads. And yes, they are driving on the left side of the road, not the correct side of the road. So I was there with 2 other pastors from the U.S. providing biblical training for local pastors and church leaders. And it was such a joy to see their commitment to learning the Word of God. I was also impressed by how they honor their guests. So one of the things that they would do is whenever we showed up somewhere to speak, they would give us a scarf like this. And so it was just a way of kind of acknowledging this is our honored guest and we're glad that they're here with us today. So I think we could learn from them. I'm not talking about myself, but I'm just thinking, like, if we have a guest, like, man, they do hospitality well. You know, I think we're kind of lame at that. Hey, we're glad you're here. Sombreros, yeah. Cowboy hat, you know. Welcome. We're glad you're here. Here's your cowboy hat. I don't know what that looks like, but I was overwhelmed by how God is working in that country. Over the past 200 years, there have been several times where the gospel has made some progress, and then the government has done everything in their power to crush it and stamp it out. For the past 30 years, they've been under a communist government, and God has allowed this season where the church is just exploding with growth. So the Baptist church there started about 25 years ago, and in that time, they've grown to the point where they're roughly 3% of the population. The population is mostly Hindu and Buddhist, but now that they've gone to the point where this is a map of just the Baptist churches in Nepal, none of these are more than 25 years old. I got to speak at one church that is 23 years old, and over the past 20 years, they've planted 20 churches. So you know, that's a pretty good track record. Imagine if Reliance could do that, right? 1 per year for 20 years. And this isn't just like, okay, so we got 3 people meeting in a house, we'll call that a church. They have very strict standards for what they will consider a church. Until there are 20 baptized believers with a leader, they don't consider it a church. It's a fellowship. So these are all churches. So it's incredible to see what God is doing, growing the church there. And so for a country of 30 million, there's roughly a million believers. They do a really cool thing on Easter Sunday. They will gather as many Christians as they can in the central square in Kathmandu in this big park. And so they'll have like 40 or 50,000 Christians show up at this park to celebrate a Sunday morning Easter service together. And that's got to be just amazing. There's one pastor down south who was talking about recently they passed an anti-conversion law, and they said that you're not allowed to share the gospel, share your faith, and try to get people to become Christians. And so the pastor was talking about how to exercise wisdom in that environment. And then he said, but you know, they can't arrest all of us. You know, the government doesn't have enough money to feed all of us. So we could probably just share our faith anyway. So anyway, there's about 219 established Baptist churches. There's another 200 fellowships, Baptist fellowships that will become churches. And so it's amazing to see what's going on there. As I saw the work that they were doing, I was reminded of a simple truth, and that is that leadership matters. The greatest strength of their church there has been godly leadership. And the single biggest need of their church is more godly leadership. And so that's what I was there doing, was trying to help them raise up more Christian leaders, pastors, Sunday school teachers, deacons, you name it. They need more leaders in their churches, and so that's really why I was there. Today we're beginning a new sermon series. We're looking at the book of Judges, and Judges it's kind of depressing. Judges is a book about a nation that was falling apart. Israel was experiencing moral and spiritual decay at every level because of a lack of godly leadership. Since we live in a nation that is experiencing moral and spiritual decay due to a lack of godly leadership, it seems appropriate that we would look at this book. And so we're going to be looking at the book of Judges and just acknowledging the fact that, man, godly leaders are needed everywhere in the world. So before we dive into the series, we're going to do something a little different today. We're going to watch a video. It's a little bit longer video. It's about 7 minutes long. It's put out by the Bible Project, which is a group that provides some really amazing biblical introductions to books and topics. And so what we're going to do is we're going to watch this. It's an introduction to the book of Judges, kind of provides an overview, and will give us some context as we're looking at this book, how to think through everything. So we'll go ahead and watch that now.
The book of Judges. So remember, after Joshua led the tribes of Israel into the promised land, he called them to be faithful to their covenant with God by obeying the commands of the Torah. And if they do this, they will show all the other nations what God is like. So Judges begins with the death of Joshua and basically tells the story of Israel's total failure. The book's name comes from the type of leaders Israel had in this period. Before they had any kings, the tribes were all governed by these judges. Now, don't think of a courtroom. These were regional, political, military leaders, more like a tribal chieftain. And you need to be warned, the book of Judges is very disturbing and violent. It tells the tragic tale of Israel's moral corruption, of its bad leadership, and basically how they become no different than the Canaanites. But this sad story is also meant to generate hope for the future, and you can see this in how the book's designed. There's a large introduction that sets the stage for Israel's failure as they don't drive out the remaining Canaanites. Then the large main section of the book has stories about the growing corruption of Israel's judges, and the progression here shows how Israel's leaders go from pretty good to okay to bad to worse. The concluding section is really disturbing and shows the corruption of the people of Israel as a whole. So let's dive in, and we can explore each part a bit more. The opening section begins with the tribes of Israel in their territories in the Promised Land. And while Joshua defeated some key Canaanite towns, there was still a lot of land to be taken and lots of Canaanites living in those areas. And so chapter 1 gives a long list of Canaanite groups and towns that Israel just failed to drive out from the land. Now, remember, the whole point of driving out the Canaanites was to avoid their moral corruption and their way of worshiping the gods through child sacrifice. God had called Israel to be a holy people, and that does not happen. Chapter 2 describes how Israel just moved in alongside the Canaanites and adopted all their cultural and religious practices. And it's right here that the story stops. For nearly a whole chapter, the narrator gives us an overview of everything that's about to happen in the body of the book. This part of Israel's history, the narrator says, was a series of cycles moving in a downward spiral. So Israel became like the Canaanites, and so they would sin against God. So God would allow them to be conquered and oppressed by the Canaanites, and eventually the Israelites would see the error of their ways and repent. So God would raise up a deliverer, a judge from among Israel who would defeat the enemy and bring about an era of peace. But eventually Israel would sin again, and it would all start over. This cycle provides the literary design and flow for the next main section of the book. It gets repeated for each of the 6 main judges whose stories are told here. Now, the stories of the first 3 judges, Othniel, Ehud, and Deborah, they are epic adventures. They're also extremely bloody stories. Either the judge themselves or people who helped the judge, they defeat their enemies and deliver the people of Israel. The stories about the next 3 judges are longer, and they focus in on the character flaws of the judges, which get increasingly worse. So Gideon, he begins pretty well. He's a coward of a man, but he eventually comes to trust that God can save Israel through him. And so he defeats a huge army of Midianites with only 300 men carrying torches and clay pots. But Gideon has a nasty temper, and he murders a bunch of fellow Israelites for not helping him in his battle. And then it all goes downhill from there. He makes an idol from the gold that he won in his battles. And then after he dies, all Israel worships the idol as a god, and the cycle begins again. The next main judge is Jephthah, who's something of a mafia thug living up in the hills. And when things get really bad for Israel, the elders come to him begging for his help. And Jephthah was a very effective leader. He won lots of battles against the Ammonites, but he was so unfamiliar with the God of Israel, he treats him like a Canaanite god. He vows to sacrifice his daughter if he wins the battle. This tragic story, it shows just how far Israel has fallen. They no longer know the character of their own God, which leads to murder and to false worship. The last judge, Samson, is by far the worst. His life began full of promise, but he has no regard for the God of Israel. He was promiscuous, violent, and arrogant. He did win brutally strategic victories over the Philistines, but only at the expense of his own integrity, and his life ends in a violent rush of mass murder. Now, a quick note here. You'll notice a repeated theme in the main section of the book, that at key moments, God's Spirit will empower each of these judges to accomplish these great acts of deliverance. Now, the fact that God uses these really screwed up people doesn't mean he endorses all or even any of their decisions. God is committed first and foremost to saving his people, but all he has to work with is these corrupt leaders. And so work with them he does. This whole section is designed to show just how bad things have gotten. You can't even tell the Israelites and the Canaanites apart anymore. And that's just the leaders. The final section shows Israel as a whole hitting bottom. There are two tragic stories here, and they are not for the faint of heart. They're structured by this key line that gets repeated 4 times at the close of the book. In those days, Israel had no king, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. The first story is about an Israelite named Micah who builds a private temple to an idol, and that gets plundered by a private army sent from the tribe of Dan. So they come and they steal everything, and then they go and burn down the peaceful city of Laish and murder all of its inhabitants. It's a horrifying story. When Israel forgets its God, might makes right. The final story of the book is even worse. It's a shocking tale of sexual abuse and violence, which all leads to Israel's first civil war. It's very disturbing. And that's the point. These stories are meant to serve as a warning. Israel's descent into self-destruction is the result of turning away from the God who loves them and saved them out of slavery in Egypt. And now, Israel needs to be delivered again from themselves. The only glimmer of hope in this story is found in this repeated line in the last part of the book. It actually forms the last sentence of the story. Israel has no king. And so the stage is set for the following books to tell the origins of King David's family, the book of Ruth, and also the origins of kingship itself in Israel, the book of 1 Samuel. But the story of Judges has value as a tragedy. It's a sobering explanation of the human condition, and ultimately it points out the need for God's grace to send a king who will rescue his people. And that's the book of Judges.
Isn't that a great video? Isn't that really, really helpful? So if you look up the Bible Project online, there's lots of videos they put together. So I think it's really helpful. Judges is a depressing book, isn't it? As you look at that summary, how it all comes together, there's moral and spiritual decay, and they just kind of just nosedive. It just gets worse and worse and worse. And yet there's a relevant message for us today. And so we're looking today at Judges chapter 1, verse 1, and we'll start off there. And we're going to see this need for an uncompromising godliness. And we're going to see this need show up over and over again through the negative example that we see in Israel. And so we're going to begin in Judges chapter 1, verse 1, and we're going to see a dramatic change that takes place here from what we had seen previously in the Bible. So let me read this for us. Judges 1, verse 1 through 7. Now it came about after the death of Joshua that the sons of Israel inquired of the Lord, saying, "Who shall go up first for us against the Canaanites to fight against them?" And the Lord said, "Judah shall go up. Behold, I've given the land into his hand." And Judah said to Simeon his brother, "Come up with me into the territory allotted to me, that we may fight against the Canaanites, and I in turn will go with you into the territory allotted you." So Simeon went with him. And Judah went up, and the Lord gave the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their hands, and they defeated 10,000 men at Bezek. They found Adonai-Bezek in Bezek, and they fought against him. And they defeated the Canaanites and the Perizzites, but Adonai-Bezek fled. And they pursued him and caught him and cut off his thumbs and big toes. Adonai-Bezek said, 70 kings with their thumbs and their big toes cut off used to gather up scraps under my table. As I have done, so God has repaid me. So they brought him to Jerusalem, and he died there. So immediately we begin with some strange, slightly disturbing stories. And there are some subtle things going on here that I want to point out. So first is the very first verse. If we compare that with Joshua 1:1, we discover that there's a comparison being made here. In Joshua 1, we read, "It came about after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord, that the Lord spoke to Joshua, the son of Nun, Moses' servant." And so when Moses died, there was very clearly a new leader in place. That was Joshua. And when that occurred, God came and spoke to Joshua. The initiative came from God. Now, in Judges, we see something very different happening, where the sons of Israel gather together without a leader. They have no clear leader, and they're asking God, what should we do next? And so God tells them. So they have no leader, but God asks them, or they ask God what they should do, and God says Judah should go up. But notice that they don't have any confidence in the Lord. So Judah isn't willing to go up as they've been told. They gather Simeon to go with them. So, okay, God wants us to go up, but we need some help. So there's no real confidence in the Lord. And then you see in verse 6 that there's no commitment to God's command. They were supposed to drive out the Canaanites. Instead, they capture this one guy who's the king, the local tribal leader, and they copy what this Canaanite king had been doing. So they cut off his big thumbs and big toes. It's just weird. But that's what they do. And so they're not committed to God's commands. They're not confident in God's command. They're not having a leader. And then we see something that's really interesting, and that's that this Canaanite king understands something that Israel never gets. He understands the just retribution that he's getting from God. He understands the consequences of what he's done, that God's paying him back for that. And Israel never gets that lesson throughout the whole thing. And so we see this very subtle thing where this Canaanite king understands a lesson that they're never going to understand. From there, we move into a whole long series of disappointments in this chapter. And so let's look in verse 8. It says, "Then the sons of Judah fought against Jerusalem and captured it and struck it with the edge of the sword and set the where the sons of Judah went down to fight against the Canaanites, living in the hill country and in the Negev and in the lowland. So Judah went against the Canaanites who lived in Hebron. Now the name of Hebron formerly was Kiriath Arba, and they struck Sheshai and Ahiman and Talmai." And so it's describing this attempt at conquest. This is what they're doing. They're continuing to move forward. And then from there, he went against the inhabitants of Debir. Now the name of Debir formerly was Kiriath Sefer. And Caleb, and let's pause here. Caleb comes onto the scene. Now, if you remember a little bit of the history of Israel, Moses had been the leader, and Moses had sent 12 spies into the land to check things out. And of those 12 spies, 10 of them had come back and said, they're terrible, they're huge, we'll never be able to conquer it. And 2 of them came back and said, no, God is good. God can help us have victory. And those 2 were Joshua and Caleb. And so when Moses passed away, Joshua was the next leader. Now Joshua is gone, and it would seem like Caleb would be a natural choice for leader. But that's not what we see here. So in verse 12, it says, "Caleb said, 'The one who attacks Kiriath Sefer and captures it, I will even give him my daughter Aksa for a wife.' So Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, captured it. So he gave him his daughter Aksa for a wife. Then it came about when she came to him that she persuaded him to ask her father for a field. And then she alighted from her donkey, and Caleb said to her, "What do you want?" And she said to him, "Give me a blessing. Since you have given me the land of the Negev, give me also springs of water." So Caleb gave her the upper springs and the lower springs. So Caleb's story, if we look at this, is a little disappointing. You would think that he would be providing a little more leadership for the nation, but he's not. But beyond that, you have to wonder, why is he using his daughter as a bargaining chip? That seems strange to us, but especially since the only other time this occurs in the book of Judges is late in the book of Judges, and it's a very negative situation. But then you also wonder, why did he give her a worthless piece of land? He gives her part of the Negev, which is the southern region. It's a lowland. It's a desert. So he gives her a piece of desert land. Why? Why would he do this? And so she has to come begging that he would provide her with some water. And so this is really kind of just a glimpse, a little bit foreshadowing of what we're going to see through the rest of the book of Judges, of how the men in the book of Judges act. They don't take responsibility in caring for the women. They don't take responsibility in things that we would expect of them. And so if you're looking for examples of godly manhood, Judges is not it. This is not where you're going to find this. It's just utter failure one time after another. Let's move on. Verse 16, we see another example of disappointment here. The descendants of the Kenite, Moses' father-in-law, went up from the city of palms with the sons of Judah to the wilderness of Judah, which is in the south of Arad. And they went and lived with the people. And then Judah went with Simeon his brother, and they struck the Canaanites living in Zaphath and utterly destroyed it. So the name of the city was called Hormah. And Judah took Gaza with its territory, and Ashkelon with its territory, and Ekron with its territory. Now the Lord was with Judah. That's a key statement. The Lord was with Judah, and they took possession of the hill country. But they could not drive out the inhabitants of the valley because they had iron chariots. Then they gave Hebron to Caleb, as Moses had promised, and he drove out from there the three sons of Anak. But the sons of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem. So the Jebusites have lived with the sons of Benjamin in Jerusalem to this day. So Judah was not able to complete their conquest because the locals had iron chariots. Now, does that seem strange to you? The Lord is with them, and yet they can't finish the job. And so, just a little bit of background here. This should not have been a surprise to them. God had told Moses back in Deuteronomy chapter 20, verse 1, God said, when you go out to battle against your enemies and you see horses and chariots and people more numerous than you, do not be afraid of them, for the Lord your God who brought you up from the land of Egypt is with you. So they had received this warning. This is going to happen. When you get there, they're going to have chariots. Be aware, the chariots are coming. Don't be afraid of this because God is with you. God can do anything. He can help you cross the Red Sea. He can part the waters, take out all the chariots behind you. God can handle this. Not a big deal. And yet, they were scared of this. Back in Joshua 11, there's a story about how several Canaanite kings with their large armies gathered against Israel, and despite their horses and chariots, the Canaanites lost that day because the Lord was with Israel. Later in the Psalms, David writes, some boast in chariots, some in horses, but we will boast in the name of the Lord our God. Right? Chariots are no big deal. This shouldn't be a big issue. And yet, at this point, Judah is not trusting in the Lord. And so a few chariots are enough to stop them. And so we see time and again this disappointment of where they're failing to trust in the Lord, and instead they're making compromises. They're going halfway. They're doing some of the conquest. They're kind of obeying God, but not completely. Verse 22. Likewise, the house of Joseph went up against Bethel, and the Lord was with them. The house of Joseph spied out Bethel. Now the name of the city was formerly Luz. And the spies saw a man coming out of the city, and they said to him, please, show us the entrance to the city, and we'll treat you kindly. So he showed them the entrance to the city, and they struck the city with the edge of the sword, but they let the man and all his family go free. And the man went into the land of the Hittites and built a city and named it Luz, which is its name to this day. So here we have an example of where, again, it says the Lord was with them, And they get to this point where they're supposed to defeat this city, and what they ultimately do is relocate this city. So they drive out this man and his family, who then goes to another place and sets up camp there and builds a city and calls that Luz. And so they're not really, again, accomplishing what God has called them to. It looks a little bit like the story of Jericho, where you have Rahab, who helps the spies, right? But the difference there is Rahab takes the initiative of saying that she has faith in the Lord, that she trusts the God of Israel, and the spies choose to allow her safety as a result. Here, it's the Israelites saying, hey, do you want safe passage? We'll give you some help. Would you help us? You know? And so instead, in this case, there's no example of this man having. But what we see is the lack of faith of the men who were sent to take conquest of this city. And so they're asking for help from the locals. Again, you see no leader, no confidence, no commitment to God's commands. And then verse 27. But Manasseh did not take possession of Bethshan and its villages, or Tanakh and its villages, or the inhabitants of Dor and its villages, or the inhabitants of Ibleam and its villages, or the inhabitants of Megiddo and its villages. So the Canaanites persisted in living in that land. By the way, you should all be thankful that you're not reading this passage this morning. These are big, hard words, and it's weird. It came about when Israel became strong that they put the Canaanites to forced labor, but they did not drive them out completely. Ephraim did not drive out the Canaanites who were living in Gezer, so the Canaanites lived in Gezer among them. Zebulun did not drive out the inhabitants of Kitron or the inhabitants of Nahalol, so the Canaanites lived among them and became subject to forced labor. Asher did not drive out the inhabitants of Akko, or the inhabitants of Sidon, or of Alab, or of Akzib, or of Helba, or of Aphek, or of Rehob. So the Asherites lived among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land, for they did not drive them out. Naphtali, which was another tribe of Israel, Naphtali did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth-Shemesh, or the inhabitants of Beth-Anath, but lived among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land. And the inhabitants of Beth-Shemesh and Beth-Anath became forced labor for them. So you see the pattern here, right? The pattern is over and over. They're failing to drive out the Canaanites, which is what God had commanded them to do. Verse 34, then the Amorites, which was one of the Canaanite people, then the Amorites forced the sons of Dan. So you have Canaanite people forcing a tribe of Israel into the hill country, for they did not allow them to come down to the valley. Yet the Amorites persisted in living in Mount Heres, in Aijalon and Shaalbim. But when the power of the house of Joseph grew strong, they became forced labor. The border of the Amorites ran from the ascent of Akrabim, from Selah and upward. So here we have one of the Canaanite people driving out some of the Israelites. And it's interesting, here in chapter 1, the only time you hear about any kind of borders of land or any of that kind of stuff happens to be the Canaanites, the Amorites here. The Amorites have clear borders of what land is theirs. The Canaanites are winning, in other words. They're the ones that have clear borders. They're the ones that seem to be victorious. Now, one thing I think might be helpful as we're looking at all of this, this is a very strange time in history. It's a strange time in our Bible. And I think one of the questions that comes up, I know this comes up, is why is God having them drive out these people? That seems strange. It sounds a lot like genocide. Okay, so what is going on here? Why is this going on? Should we look at this and think, okay, so maybe God endorses genocide, right? Is that what's going on here? And so to understand this, I think we need to pause for just a second and go back and look at a little bit of history. I don't have the verses up on this, but let me just walk you through a couple things here. Genesis chapter 15. Back in Genesis 15, we have a description of what was going on 400 years earlier. And so what's going on here in this passage is God has made a covenant with Abraham. And the covenant is that God is going to bless Abraham. He's going to give him a great family. His family is going to be a blessing to all nations. But one of the things that God is going to do for Abraham is give him a land. He's going to give him the promised land, which happens to belong to the Canaanites. And so the Canaanites would probably be very upset to hear that God has just promised their land to somebody else. And so we have to wonder, okay, what's exactly going on here? Why is God doing this? And so if you look at Genesis 15, verse 7, God says to Abraham, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess it. And he said, O Lord God, how may I know that I will possess it? And so God makes a covenant with Abraham here. And God establishes this. He performs a sacrifice, and it's a very visual display. And then down in verse 13, God explains the process of how this is going to happen. So verse 13, Genesis 15, God said to Abram, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed 400 years. That's the time in Egypt. And so it's no surprise they end up in Egypt. God knew this. God told Abram this would happen. But he says, but I will also judge the nation whom they will serve, and afterward they will come out with many possessions. And as for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You will be buried at a good old age. Then, this is the key part, Genesis 15, verse 16, then in the fourth generation they will return here to the promised land, for the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete. And so what God is telling them is, I am planning on judging this people, but I'm giving them time. The sins of the Amorite is not yet complete. And so God was waiting for the appropriate time to bring judgment upon this people, and he was going to allow them the freedom to continue on their path. Now, you saw it in the video that we watched there. One of the things that the Canaanites did, including the Amorites, one of the things that they did was they worshiped Baal. And as part of their Baal worship, they would perform child sacrifices. So they would sacrifice their newborn baby to a fertility god, hoping that God would bless their land. And this was appalling. This was appalling to God. It should have been appalling to the Israelites, but we read later that they get caught up in this same practice. And so God tells them, I'm going to give you this land. If we look over in Deuteronomy chapter 7, we find a little more background. So Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 1 through 6 says, the Lord your God brings you into the land where you are entering to possess it, and clears away many nations before you, the Hittites and the Girgashites and the Amorites, the Canaanites and the Perizzites and the Hippites and Jebusites, 7 nations greater and stronger than you. And when the Lord your God delivers them before you and you defeat them, then you shall utterly destroy them. You shall make no covenant with them and show no favor to them. Furthermore, you shall not intermarry with them. You shall not give daughters to their sons, nor shall you take their daughters for your sons. For they will turn sons away from following me to serve other gods. The anger of the Lord will be kindled against you, and he will quickly destroy you. But thus you shall do to them. You shall tear down their altars, and smash their sacred pillars, and hew down their Asherim, and burn their graven images with fire. For you are a holy people to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for his own possession out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. And so we see that God is calling them to be set apart. And he just knows that if they go into the land and they live among the Canaanites, that they're going to adopt the practices of the Canaanites. And so he says, drive them out of the land. And so they start to, and they have a little bit of a good start, but they don't go all the way. And so as a result, Judges chapter 2, we receive a declaration from the Lord. And this is God's response to how things are going. We've seen up to this point just failure after failure. They're not driving the people out before them. And so this is what happens in Judges chapter 2. Now the angel of the Lord came up from Gilgal to Bochim, and he said, I brought you up out of Egypt and led you into the land which I've sworn to your fathers. And I said, I will never break my covenant with you. And as for you, you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You shall tear down their altars. But you've not obeyed me. What is this that you have done? Therefore I also said, I will not drive them out before you, but they will become as thorns in your sides, and their gods will be a snare to you. When the angel of the Lord spoke these words to all the sons of Israel, the people lifted up their voices and wept. So they named that place Bochim, which means weeping. And there they sacrificed to the Lord. So there's a problem here. God identifies the problem as faithful to the covenant that he had made with them. He wanted to establish himself as their God. He wanted to establish this relationship with his people. And yet they were making compromises. They were not following through on what God had commanded. And so, as a result, God allows them to face the consequences of their actions. And so the Canaanites and their false gods would be a continued problem, a thorn in the flesh for them. Now, I wonder if we're in danger of falling into this same kind of trap. God said that the Israelites were guilty of making covenants with the inhabitants of the land. This was a problem because Israel was going to adopt some of the sacrifices and different practices of the Canaanites, including child sacrifice. Now, I seriously doubt that anybody here is in any danger of sacrificing their child to a Canaanite fertility god. Is that fair? Probably not going to happen. So we can all acknowledge that that's probably not the same temptation, but I think the temptation to compromise is every bit as strong today as it's ever been. And so I want us to think for just a couple minutes here about what kind of temptations we face to compromise with the people around us. Okay, so our temptations are going to look very different, right? We're not here to drive out the Canaanites before us. And yet, God has called us to be a holy people. Throughout the New Testament, we're referred to as the saints, right? Which sometimes seems humorous. But God calls us saints. We are the holy ones. We are set apart for God. So, last month, Jacob was preaching through James, and James 4:4 says, friendship with the world is hostility toward God. So my question is, as we're looking at this, is what does it look like to buddy up with the world today? What does it look like to be a friend of the world in this kind of way? I think there's a lot of different ways that we can make worldly compromises. I'll name just a couple. One is a lack of financial integrity. Right, so we know that God expects honest business dealings. Maybe it'd be okay if we just fudge the numbers a little bit. Right? That kind of lack of financial integrity, whether it's on your taxes or at work or whatever, that kind of lack of financial integrity should not exist among the people of God. And yet, sometimes it does. Or maybe it's a lack of moral integrity. You guys know all about the Me Too movement that's all through the news right now. Unfortunately, there are times among God's people where
sexual immorality exists, and this should not be so, right? And so God has called us to be set apart as a holy people, honoring to him. And we know that the world engages in sexual immorality. God expects sexual purity. Maybe it'd be okay if we compromise just a little bit, right? That's the temptation. Maybe it's a lack of spiritual integrity. You know, we know that God expects us to faithfully follow Christ. Have we convinced ourselves that it's okay for worship to be reduced to just an hour on Sunday morning? Romans 12:1 says, don't be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And that's more than just Sunday morning, right? That's your whole life, right? We are living in a holy sacrifice. Everything about my life should be an expression of worship to my God. It's not just the songs we sing. That's an important part of worship. I had the privilege this time in Nepal. I got to spend a week teaching on biblical worship, walking from the Old Testament all the way through the New Testament and seeing how the Old Testament pointed ahead to Christ, and all of that was fulfilled. And so Christ is the center of our worship, and we get to see how the presence of God is no longer separate from us. The presence of God is here in our lives, right? And so worship should be everything we do, right? And yet, do we reduce it to the morning for an hour, you know, and then you go back to living your life just like everybody else, right? And so it's bad enough. It's bad enough when we, as the holy people of God, set apart for his purpose, compromise with the world. But it's really bad for those of us who God has put into any kind of a leadership position. And so those leadership positions are all kinds of different places. You know, some of you are leaders in your family, leaders in school, leaders at work, leaders in your neighborhood, wherever. God has put you in positions of leadership in different ways, right? And we desperately need godly leaders. The book of Judges is just an expose on how bad it can get, right? We desperately need godly leaders. Man, it's so easy for us to compromise. As we see in the book of Judges, as we're going to study on, every aspect of society suffers when leaders fail to follow God's ways. And so I want to ask you guys to just consider, just think about it. Are there ways where you are compromising with the world around you? Are you choosing, so to speak, to live like a Canaanite when God has called you to be set apart? Are there any ways where you are compromising your integrity and living like the world? I'm going to ask Danielle if she could come up and play for us for a moment. What I'd like for us to do is spend just a little bit of time in quiet confession before the Lord. And the way I want you to think through this is, are there specific areas of sin in my life that God is not pleased with, that I need to bring before him and acknowledge before him and confess to him and allow him to make right in my life? We are to be a people set apart for God's holy purposes. Right? Let's make sure we're living that way. Let's allow God to examine our hearts. Let's close our eyes for a minute and pray to him. Father, you are our God, and you have loved us. You have been so faithful to us. Lord, we